Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Joe and Alan, for setting me up so nicely. And I'm really conscious that we have one speaker after another and not much chance for interaction. And I would like to have a little bit of interaction with you. So I'm going to see if I can limit what I have to say all in one piece to, well, we'll see, 15 or 20 minutes so that we could have a few minutes for discussion. So the topic is integral ecology, and this term actually was first proposed by Thomas Berry, apparently, a number of years ago, and was also used by liberation theologian Leonardo Boff, but it was taken up and actually by a student, a former student of CIS, Sean Hargens, a dear friend, who is now a professor at JFK University. And he and his colleague, Michael Zimmerman, just came out with a very fat book called Integral Ecology, which is a landmark in integral studies, integral theory, and has really set a high bar for those who are interested in this notion of integral ecology. Now, Hargens and Zimmerman's book is fundamentally Wilberian. It uses Wilber's understanding of integral, which is summarized with this acronym AQUAL, all quadrants, all levels, right? The quadrants are basically 4 areas that you get by crossing 2 polar axes, interior, exterior, individual, collective. And then the levels are basically body, mind, and spirit, although you can add more levels if you like. It's a very powerful framework which in Hargens and Zimmerman's hands allows them to speak intelligently about more than 200 different schools of ecology right now. So we may think of ecology as a unitary discipline, but actually there are many, many schools of ecology, from the strictly scientific branches of ecology, like marine ecology or landscape ecology or global systems ecology and so on. The list goes on and on and on. Atmospheric ecology, to political ecology, spiritual ecology, and so on. So I encourage you to look at Hargens and Zimmerman's book for a Wilberian approach to integral ecology. The approach that I'm taking, however, is, while friendly to the Wilberian approach, is not a Wilberian approach. The way I see it, there are at least 2 ways of getting at what integral is. One way is to come up with a kind of visual map, a kind of space. And in Wilber's case, you have this image of the quadrants and the lines and the levels. And that's very useful. Once you have this space, then you can put a lot of things in it and use it to organize it. So there's a place for everything and everything in its place. Right? And it can be, the virtue is that you can find a place for everything. The drawback is that many of the things that get put in those places don't recognize the place that they're being put in, or they're feeling that it's a bit of a tight fit. So, but we can avoid that danger by not taking the map as the territory, by not clinging too literally to these kinds of conceptual spaces. We use them as heuristic methods for deepening into these complex issues. So it's a very valuable way toward the integral. I respect it, I love it, I've spent many years studying it, and I will continue to engage with it. However, the direction that I take is more, is not so much in this way of finding a system, a kind of spatial system or map, but rather of cultivating a method in the sense of a way of thinking about things. So it's a way of thinking. And here, 2 of the guiding principles are wholeness. Alan mentioned holism as a kind of predecessor for the idea of integral, and complexity. So already in my doctoral dissertation on Hegel and Jung, Hegel, a great sort of proto-integral theorist, I proposed this notion of complex holism to try to communicate the essence of this way of thinking about what we would call integral. All right. So what would an integral ecology be? I want to talk about see if I can get through this quickly. 4 characteristics, 4 words that to me say something essential about what an integral ecology would be. And I think in many ways the Wilbur-Hargan-Zimmerman integral ecology satisfy these categories as well. But the way I approach them is slightly different in flavor and orientation. The 4 words or qualities are planetary, transdisciplinary, enchanted, or we might say re-enchanted, and engaged. So I want to say something a little bit about all 4 of these. So planetary. It probably would be no exaggeration to say that both ecology as a science and the wider environmental movement that followed. Now, ecology as a science is only a little over 100 years old. Environmentalism is only about 40 years old. But we could say ecology as a science, the ecological worldview, environmentalism on the one hand, and integralism as an impulse, as a movement, both of these could be seen as responses to a dawning consciousness of what some people call the planetary era. Okay? Now, the planetary era is another way of describing the true nature of what used to be called the modern period, right, which began around 500 years ago. Something fundamentally different started to happen about 500 years ago. And what that difference is this. About 500 years ago, for the first time in the history of our species, human beings started to enter into an increasingly constant, ongoing communication with one another from all continents on the planet. Of course, this happened through colonialism and colonial expansion and so on to begin with. And this involved communication, not only cultural communication, but the exchange of genetic material, of viruses, of foodstuff, and all sorts of things, which initially was quite slow. Right? It used to take weeks and sometimes months to go between continent and continent. But fairly soon after the beginning of the planetary era, around 500 years ago, you get the scientific revolution, and then a little bit later you get the political revolutions, the industrial revolution, and from the 19th century to our own point now, the face of the planet is literally transformed in a way that in our own time has brought a 65 million year geological period to a close. Right? We are living now at the end of a 65 million year geological period called the Cenozoic. That period began with the end of the previous period when the dinosaurs lived, and that period was brought to an end by probably a giant asteroid that hit the planet, changed the planetary ecology, wiped out most of the species on the planet, and which eventually gave rise to the Cenozoic, right, during which mammals evolved, and we were very latecomers in that period. So this is very significant, a 65 million year period coming to a close. And why is it coming to a close? Because of climate change, habitat loss, and a mass extinction of species. Right? We haven't had a mass extinction of species in 65 million years. This is very, very significant. And it's coming about because of the changes that were initiated at the beginning of the planetary era. Those changes didn't really become apparent until the 20th century, however, with the world wars, the first time that we had world wars, and then with the population explosion, and starting in the 60s and 70s with the birth of the environmental movement and ecology as it entered the popular consciousness. So there's a sense in which the modern period is the planetary period. And that's becoming increasingly obvious to us now with the global financial crisis, global climate change, and so on. It wasn't so obvious a century ago, although some people saw it. Sri Aurobindo saw it, thought in planetary terms. Jung, Teilhard, Gebser, all of these proto-integral thinkers were already thinking in planetary terms. All right. Now, ecology, you might think, is already planetary, but not necessarily. Some scientific ecology often focuses on a very small piece of the planet, a little niche, or might focus on a particular organism in its environment. But as we know, it's impossible to separate the life of a single organism or a single community of organisms from the totality of communities of organisms which constitutes the planet. We know now that there is no boundary in life on the planet between organisms and their communities and between communities. We are a single interdependent planet. So an integral ecology is obviously a planetary ecology, and within the notion of a planetary ecology, a central role is played at a theoretical level by what we mean by the planet. And here, a fascinating new development has to do with Gaia theory. How many of you have heard of Gaia theory? Just about everybody. That's great. So standard Gaia theory, which was invented by James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis, the basic idea is that the Earth as a whole, the Earth as a whole is a single self-organizing, self-regulating system. And not only that, but this self-organizing, self-regulating system became that way through and for life. Right? The reason why we can breathe the air right now, that it has just the right proportion of oxygen, the reason why life can sustain itself and flourish with just the right amount of carbon dioxide and so on, is because life evolved on the planet in such a way to make those conditions just right. So life constituted the air we breathe, set up a regular temperature, a regular proportion of salt in the oceans, a regular cycle of carbon circling through and nitrogen and so on, all of these important chemicals, all of that is created by life, for life, so that life can flourish. So the planet as a whole is a single self-regulating system. We might say guided by and for the biosphere. So the thin envelope of life that encircles the planet but actually reaches down into the ocean and even into the rocks a little bit and even a little bit up into the atmosphere. That's standard Gaia theory. Now, Alan mentioned Teilhard de Chardin, who is one of the inventors of another term called noosphere. How many of you heard of the term noosphere? That's impressive. Almost pretty much as many of you as heard of biosphere. I think many people outside of our circles won't know what that means, noosphere. But it comes from the Greek word nous, one of the words for mind. And the idea here is that especially with the emergence of humans on the planet, and especially once humans had occupied every continent on the planet and started to be in ongoing communication with each other from every continent on the planet, you have a new envelope surrounding the planet that is subtler than the envelope of life and permeates life, and that is the envelope of consciousness or thought, the noosphere. Now, although invisible and subtle, it has profound effects. We know that because it is the noosphere and what happens in the noosphere that is bringing a 65 million year geological period to a close. It is what's happening in the noosphere at the level of thought and consciousness, which is endangering the majority of species on the planet and which is threatening the very foundations of human civilization on the planet. It's thought and consciousness, right? So an integral ecology, especially if it's working toward an integral theory of Gaia or the planet, can't just focus on the biosphere. It needs to include the noosphere as well, since the biosphere now is equally dependent on the noosphere. The noosphere, of course, is dependent on the biosphere. If life collapses, if the ecosystems collapse, mind, consciousness, civilization will collapse. It might continue to exist in impoverished forms, but it'll collapse as we know it. It won't flourish. So the noosphere depends on the biosphere, but the biosphere also depends on the noosphere, right? You see, there's a two-way complex dependence. And this is what I mean about learning how to think in a complex way. It's not only that we have a map that shows you've got the biosphere here and then the noosphere there. That's great. But the question is, how are they related to each other? And they're related in complex ways. This is one of the key ingredients of integral. What integral means is complexity, learning how to think in complex ways. All right, so that's planetary. Just think planetary, Gaia theory, biosphere, noosphere, complexly related. Okay, just to summarize that. If you do that, then to do that, I should say, you need to cultivate what I call a transdisciplinary way of thinking, transdisciplinary consciousness. Now, we've all heard of multidisciplinary, pluridisciplinary, interdisciplinary, but what is transdisciplinary? Well, I was trying to think of an analogy on the way, and it's probably not a very good analogy, but on your computer, you may have several search engines. I only have Internet Explorer, but some people I know also have Safari, and now there's Google, Google Chrome, and what else is there? There's, well, there used to be Firefox, yeah, and there used to be Netscape and so on. Now, each of these browsers have their own interface. They each have their own virtues. They can do some of these browsers can do things that other browsers can't do, right? They all look differently. They have their own language, their own names, and so on. If you were looking for something on the internet, you could choose to use one browser or use another browser. So the browsers are like disciplines. This is just an analogy, right? So interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary approaches might be like being able to use several browsers to look for something on the internet. I only use one, so I'm only familiar with one in terms of internet. But I could easily learn how to use other browsers, and I would